Hello, everyone. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hi, Berman.
I could not be more excited to do this tonight. I love this book, and I would not say that about just any book. I truly love it. It's got three things that I adore in books. Number one, it's got politics. Number two, it's got the 1970s, which are awesome. And number three, it's Jeffrey Toobin's writing, which is really so vivid, so exciting. He's one of my favorite writers. I've said this to his face before, so he's not embarrassed to hear this, I'm sure.
I enjoy hearing it, actually. I'm not embarrassed at all.
But it's great, and the writing's terrific, and it really brings all of this to life. So I'm just going to jump right in. Let's talk about pardons. All right, so my first question is, why do we have them / alternative question, whose fault is it?
Well, that assumes it's a fault, and we can talk about whether the value or not. But the answer is pardons are an anomaly under our Constitution. I think most of us know that that the Constitution was designed for the most part as a system of checks and balances, where each branch of government has some measure of control over the other. A pardon is different. A pardon is a unilateral power of the president. It is not subject to any control of the courts. The legislature can't overrule it. And it is the part of the Constitution that comes most directly from the authority of the kings of Great Britain. And that was chiefly the work of Alexander Hamilton, who was the member of the founding generation who was most interested in establishing a strong presidency. If you recall, the Articles of Confederation, where there was no chief executive, failed, had the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and it was Hamilton more than anywhere else, more than even James Madison, who wanted a strong president. And as he wrote in the Federalist Papers, he wanted it because it could exercise mercy when people were perhaps unduly punished, but also it could be an instrument of political power on the part of the president. And those two objectives, both mercy and political power, have been in tension throughout our whole history.
Are pardons and were pardons, as they came to be known in Britain before the United States, and then for our last 250 years, are they primarily moral, legal, or should we understand them as something else?
Well, that depends on who's granting the pardon. Because I mean, one of the themes of the book is that pardons offer an X-ray into the souls of presidents. You can learn a lot about presidents by whom they do and do not pardon. But as a general matter, I believe that pardons are political. They are an exercise of political power, often for political reasons. And that's not necessarily a criticism. I'm sorry, my voice cracked. I'm very young. That's not a criticism, but it is just a fact. And as I say, political acts can be good or bad, but they are always political.
And that's why I asked the question. You make a compelling case in this book that you'll basically, if you try to think of pardons as anything other than political, you'll basically pull a muscle. I mean, you're not doing yourself any favors by thinking they're anything other than not naked politics, but basic politics.
Well, and sometimes naked politics, and sometimes they are done for reasons having very little to do with even the individuals involved. They're done for the message that they send to the broader political world, but they are always political in one way or another.
And you sort of addressed this, what checks or limitations are there on pardons?
Well, there are two, but they are barely checks at all. One is that a president of the United States can only pardon someone for federal crimes. And most crime in this country is prosecuted by states. Most blue-collar crime, murder, various kinds of assault, robbery, are prosecuted at the state level, and a presidential pardon can't cover those. The other limitation is a presidential pardon can't cover future criminality. You can't be pardoned for acts, you can't be given a license to violate the law in the future, but those are two very modest limitations, so it's a very broad power.
And impeachment, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, impeachment, and this is important because the British have an unwritten constitution, but they do have a constitution, and under the British Constitution, the king could not pardon per impeachments, and so that limitation comes directly from the British as well.
In the United States, and I want to jump in. So the book there's two things that happen in this book that are fantastic. Number one is you get this, I think, legal explanation of what a pardon is and the history behind it. And two, this really deep dive into Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon, which I think is probably more tangible for people. We'll talk more about that. But before we get there, just a few more things on the pardon itself. Has it changed? How has the idea of how pardons are used, when and how, changed over U.S. history?
Well, it depends how granular you want to get. I mean, I think, the pardon always reflects to a certain extent, the politics of the day. In the 19th century, there was no such thing as parole in the federal prisons. So the only way you could get out of prison in advance of the expiration of your sentence in the 19th century was by a presidential pardon, and as a result, there were actually a lot of pardons proportionally. Rutherford B. Hayes doesn't get a lot of attention, Rutherford B. Hayes, but he set the record for the most pardons. He pardoned 1,000 people, including 44 people on death row. In the 1920s, parole came into the federal system and was, as a result, the number of pardons went down because presidents felt they didn't have to get involved in that part of the system anymore. And one reason why the pardon of Richard Nixon in 1974 was so controversial is that people just didn't know about the pardon power, hadn't thought about the pardon power, so it came out of the blue in many ways.
And to that end, when did the last second, final days, final weeks wave of pardons come into vogue?
Well, after 1974, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to this, the pardon of Nixon was very controversial, and many people believe that it was very important in a factor in Ford's defeat by Jimmy Carter in 1976. But as a result of that, there was a kind of taint to pardons, that it was considered politically risky, politically something you didn't want to do. So presidents tended to do it at the very end of their terms when there was no accountability. The first really controversial pardons after 1974 were George Herbert Walker Bush, who was very angry at Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel who investigated Iran-Contra. He pardoned everyone that Walsh had prosecuted at the end of his term. 8 years later, Bill Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, the fugitive financier, at the end of his term. So it was really after Nixon that the end-of-term pardon became kind of the custom for things presidents didn't want you to pay attention to.
So let's talk about Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. How much did Gerald Ford know about pardons in the weeks before he became president?
This was so interesting. I mean, 1974, I believe there are people in this room who were alive in 1974. So I'm going to take the liberty of assuming they know who Richard Nixon is and who Gerald Ford was. But just to refresh your memory, in October of 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president in a separate scandal from Watergate. And Richard Nixon became the first president to use the provisions of the 22nd Amendment. Because before the 22nd Amendment, if a vice president died, there was no way to replace him. When FDR died, Harry Truman didn't have a vice president till he ran in his own right. When JFK died, LBJ didn't have a vice president until he ran in his own right. But under the 22nd Amendment, the Congress, the House and the Senate had the right to majority approval of the president's nominee for vice president, and Nixon was presented with a dilemma because both the House and Senate were in Democratic hands, and he was a Republican, so we needed to name someone who would be acceptable. And Gerald Ford was the minority leader of the House of Representatives, but not a particularly controversial figure, and that's why he was named. Now, if there's one thing people remember about Gerald Ford, is that he was a star football player at the University of Michigan in his day, and he took seriously the idea of being a team player. And what that meant in political terms was during the period from January, when he was confirmed, until August, when he became president, just 8 months, or a little more than 8 months, he went out of his way not to look like he was angling for the job of president. And he didn't want to be seen to be preparing for it, and he didn't want to be seen as trying to, game the system of what was going on. So he compelled himself to a kind of intentional ignorance about much of what was going on, particularly as it related to Watergate. And as for pardons, he knew very, very little.
Had the issue come up for him at all in, say, his confirmation hearings?
Yes, he did, but very much in passing. He was asked on one question about, and the word pardon wasn't used, but the question was clearly, would you pardon Richard Nixon if you became president? And he said, I don't think the public would stand for it. That's the exact words he used. And one of the many interesting things about working on this book was learning or seeing how small the news universe was in those days. There were three network news shows. There was no CNN. There was no cable at all. There was no internet at all. There were no national newspapers at all. The only way people could see something if they cared was in the New York Times, but that didn't really circulate out of New York and Washington. And the New York Times thought that answer was so insignificant they didn't even include it in the transcripts they ran of Ford's testimony.
Yeah, it was interesting to me that it had come up at all. I mean, it did come up vaguely. He did address it, but then not again. Then really not again for him until the days before Richard Nixon resigned, and then he hears from Al Haig.
Al Haig. I mean, Al Haig is such a great character, I don't know if sinister is the right word, but certainly conniving is the right word. And he operates in this period and in this story as a kind of double agent, because he is Nixon's last chief of staff. He came from Henry Kissinger's staff, and but then stays on to be Ford's chief of staff. And just to refresh your recollection, as the lawyers say, Nixon announces his resignation on August 8th, and Ford becomes president on August 9th. On August 1st, Haig contrives to meet alone with Ford and basically tells him, you can pardon Nixon. And then he'll become president. I mean, in all but so many words, he says to Ford, let's make a deal. You agree to pardon Nixon and he'll resign. Now, and this led to a lot of conspiracy talk over the years that there was such a deal. I believe that Ford, quite properly, said, I'm not agreeing to anything, in part because by August 1st, Nixon was doomed. The smoking gun White House tape had come out. There was no way he was going to remain in office either through resignation or impeachment and removal from office. But also the kind of person Ford was. Ford was not going to make that kind of deal. I mean, he had too much integrity. But it was not until August 1st that Ford had even thought about the issue of pardons, but at that point he did.
And I'm going to come back to that in a second,
Okay.
because I think one key question is, how did his intentional lack of preparation then impact his first month in office and the ultimate decision to pardon? We'll come back to that in just a second, because pardons also, Ford aside, in Richard Nixon's world, for over a year, the idea of presidential pardons, not for Nixon, but from Nixon for others, played at Watergate.
Right. This is where it was my first experience in using the White House tapes as a resource, and they are really amazing. Not least because Berman and I, one of our contributors at CNN was John Dean, who became a friend of mine and has written a number of books. And I had frequently had the surreal experience of listening to a White House tape and then calling John on the phone saying, "John, what did you mean when you said there was a cancer on the presidency?" Anyway, after the Watergate break-in happens on June 17th, 1972. Early in the presidential election year, and very soon thereafter, the White House starts to mobilize to keep a damper on the investigation. That's what the White House cover-up is. And one of the things that particularly two of the people involved, who were sort of the supervisors of the break-in, E. Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, started demanding pardons. And saying, like, we're doing this at your instigation. We don't want to go to prison for this. And Nixon and Dean have these conversations about whether they can do a pardon, and they recognize the political peril that would come from that. Fast forward to Donald Trump in his first term. He's in his second term now. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But in his first term, he all but openly suggested he might pardon the various people who were in the Mueller investigation, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and Michael Flynn, and then did in fact pardon them. And I think that's an interesting illustration about how the norms that even Richard Nixon observed, Donald Trump didn't.
And in a way, these are bookends. So
yes,
I
won't give it away, but Donald Trump issued some controversial pardons. You might.
And so, just why didn't Nixon pardon any of those people?
Because the outrage would have been too great. I mean, this is where the news, the news whole is just so different. In the mid-1970s, just to generalize, but I think accurately, the American people dealt with a fairly clear shared set of facts, mostly distributed by Walter Cronkite. I mean, that was sort of how, the ratings, 20 million people watch Walter Cronkite. Even Fox News, which is a very important, 3 million people watch. I mean, it's a very different thing. And if there was a assumption on the part of Nixon and Dean that they couldn't stand the heat of a sort of centrist news operation saying this was outrageous, because it would have been outrageous.
Of all the things Nixon did and could do, the one thing he couldn't do was pardon anyone. He could force himself to pardon anyone. All right, Gerald Ford is now in the White House. What pushes him to the point where he decides that he is going to pardon Richard Nixon?
Well, there's one issue which is central to the Ford pardon that is related but somewhat different, and that's the story of the White House tapes and the White House records. Before Nixon, every president had treated as his personal property all of the papers generated by the White House during his presidency. After Lyndon Johnson left office, he just pulled up a big van and took it all to Austin for his presidential library. Other presidents, Ulysses Grant, sold some of his papers. I mean, and Ford had no idea about this. And the problem was, this wasn't just the end of a normal presidency. The White House tapes in particular, and many of the papers, were evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. But Nixon, in his cleverness, he resigns on August 9th, flies out to San Clemente. The next day, calls Alexander Haig and says, send me my papers, send me my tapes, because it all belongs to me. Now, here's just a little bit of a sidelight. Ford has no idea about any of this. So he calls his attorney general and says, what's the law on this? The attorney general calls a young lawyer on his staff named Antonin Scalia, and Antonin Scalia writes a long memo about this that's actually very clever. The memo says, well, it's the custom that the president keeps his papers. It's the tradition that the president keeps his papers, but there is no law to that effect. And, you know, Scalia, who believed in a strong presidency, sort of downplays the fact that there's not really a law. And Ford, very much to his credit, says, I'm not sending these things out there. You know, there's part of an investigation. But on August 24th, he becomes president on August 9th, he holds his first news conference. And he gets some questions about what's going to happen to Nixon's papers. Are you going to give him the tapes? What if he destroys the tapes? And Ford is ill-prepared and angry about this. He gets frustrated. It's like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to hear about Nixon. I need to move on. And it's that press conference and the questions that are asked that start to give him the idea of sort of lancing the boil and giving a pardon so that all this gets behind him, he thinks.
It's the media's fault.
As usual.
As usual.
As is customary.
It's the media's
yes.
fault. So he decides he's going to do it, and then how free-flowing and open is the discussion within the White House about whether or not he should follow through?
This is so unbelievable to me. You know, even in 1974, the President of the United States has a lot of resources at his command. He has the White House counsel's office. He has the entire Department of Justice. Gerald Ford calls on a friend of his who is a part-time volunteer named Benton Becker, who had done some work for him when he was in the Congress, and he brings Benton Becker in over Labor Day weekend and says, go find out what the law is on pardons, like by himself. And this 35-year-old guy, who, by the way, is also under criminal investigation at the same time. It's just the idea that Benton Becker is the brains of this operation is really kind of shocking. And he comes back with some basic facts about impeachment, about pardons, but he finds a Supreme Court case that fascinates him and fascinates Ford. 1915, a case no one had ever heard of then. I certainly had never heard of until I started working on this book. United States versus George Burdick. George Burdick was an investigative journalist at at one of the many New York newspapers at the time, and he does an expose of corruption in the Customs Service. The U.S. Attorney wants to investigate that and calls Burdick to the grand jury. Burdick says, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm going to take the fifth. The U.S. Attorney says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, to issue you a presidential pardon so you can't be prosecuted. He says, I don't care about the pardon. I'm not speaking. Burdick goes to prison. While he's in prison, the case gets appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and Burdick wins. And the reason he wins is that the Supreme Court says in U.S. v. Burdick that a pardon is only in effect if it's accepted. And if it's accepted, that's an acknowledgement of guilt. And Ford and Benton Becker get obsessed with this, and they think, oh no, what if Nixon doesn't accept a pardon? We need to talk him into accepting a pardon. Meanwhile, Nixon's in San Clemente, he's dying for a pardon. He doesn't care about the Burdick case. No one cares about the Burdick case. No one knows about it even today. And this stray line in a Supreme Court opinion about acknowledgement of guilt, no one cared about then, no one cares about now. But Ford gets obsessed with this and sends Becker on this secret mission on a Air Force plane to San Clemente to try to talk Nixon into accepting a pardon.
And Ford thinks accepting some level of guilt.
Accepting some level of guilt. And they have this sort of negotiation about this mealy-mouthed statement that Nixon agreed to, where he says, I trusted my aides too much. I mean, it was a ridiculously non-specific and non-serious acceptance of responsibility, but it was good enough for Ford and it was good enough for Becker.
Just to be clear, because it relates now, I mean, is there anyone who thinks that accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt?
Well, the handful of people who have read United States versus Burdick think that. But, one thing you did not hear when President Trump pardoned 1,500 people at January 6th is, they're now all admitting they were wrong. No one heard that because no one thought it was true. I mean, I say in the book that this obsession with the Burdick case illustrates the limits of a law school education. That, if you think that something appears in a Supreme Court opinion, it means that everybody has read it and everybody agrees with it. No, I mean, it was just, it was, Ford was a lawyer, Becker was a lawyer, Phil Buchan, who was the White House counsel, who was peripherally involved. They were wildly misled by their reading of this case.
How much did Richard Nixon even need a pardon from a legal standpoint?
Well, that's the other part of this. See, the other thing about it, you asked an earlier question that I didn't answer properly, is that Ford held the decision very closely about the fact that he was going to do this. I mean, literally 5 or 6 people in the White House knew that he was planning on this pardon. What he didn't do, he didn't do 2 things. One, he didn't prepare his allies on Capitol Hill. It's customary to do trial balloons, to pre-wire statements, just so your supporters know what's coming and they're prepared to support you. Didn't do that at all. It came as a complete surprise. Also, he didn't do any proper research with Leon Jaworski. Leon Jaworski was the Watergate special prosecutor at the time, who was dealing with a fired-up staff of young prosecutors who did want to pardon Nixon, but Jaworski didn't want to pardon Nixon, and it ultimately would have been his decision whether to file a case.
He didn't want to prosecute.
He didn't want to prosecute.
That's the key.
That's the key. He didn't want to prosecute Nixon. So at a fundamental level, the pardon was unnecessary because he was never going to get prosecuted anyway. But because Ford operated in such secrecy and with such speed, he didn't even realize that.
How did Gerald Ford feel for the next 30 years of his life about the pardon?
Well, that's actually quite poignant and interesting. I think Ford did something after the pardon in October. The pardon was September 8th, so exactly 1 month after the resignation. Ford agreed, first and only time in American history, to testify under oath before Congress about the pardon, where he said there was no deal. And he did it, he said, because he thought it would move the country past Watergate. And I believe he was absolutely honest. I still think the pardon was a bad idea, but I think Ford did it for the right reasons. If I can just jump ahead, and this is one reason why I decided to write this book at this time, there has been a clear change in the conventional wisdom about Ford's pardon of Nixon, symbolized most dramatically by an event in May of 2001. Ted Kennedy, who was still in the Senate at that point, at the Kennedy Library in Boston, they give out this award every year called the Profiles in Courage.
When it's open, when it's not shut down.
When it's not shut down because they don't have the money to stay open, right. But when it's open, they give the Profiles in Courage Award. And Ted Kennedy gave that award in 2001 to Gerald Ford, saying, I criticized the pardon at the time, and I was wrong, and you were right. At right around the same time, Bob Woodward, the great Watergate journalist, wrote something where he said, I was wrong about the pardon, And you were right, President Ford. In the argument of the Trump case in the Supreme Court, Justice Brett Kavanaugh asks a question, sort of in passing, says, well, you know, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, and you know, everybody thought it was a bad idea at the time, but now everybody thinks it was the right thing to do. I think Kavanaugh was correct, if not everybody, about the way things have shifted. One reason I wrote the book is that I think the country was right in the first place, that the pardon was a bad idea, but I think Ford, particularly late in his life, felt somewhat vindicated by the pardon.
Though he did carry the Burdick case?
Right. He carried around the page of the Burdick case in his wallet for the rest of his life. See, acknowledgement of guilt. See, acknowledgement of guilt.
Look,
but that's what you're right. Yes, that's what he said.
Okay. So what doors, you make a compelling case. Jeffrey Toobin's the one who thinks that the pardon was a bad idea. What Pandora's box did it open? What did it do to us now that Ford pardoned Nixon then?
Well, I think, you know, it restored Hamilton's idea that, you know, pardons could work to the political benefit of the president. Ford made a egregious political mistake. I mean, he misjudged the politics, but he was clearly doing it for a political reason. And I think, for good or ill, presidents have seen the pardon as more of a political act since then. And now, in certain respects, for good reason. Jimmy Carter, upon the day he was inaugurated, as he promised during the campaign, pardoned all the draft resistors who fled to Canada, because he thought that would be a healing gesture. Barack Obama, in the last year of his presidency, issued commutations. A pardon eliminates a conviction as if it never happened. A commutation simply lets someone out of prison. Obama commuted the sentences of about 1,500 low-level drug dealers who he thought got unduly harsh sentences, which I thought was appropriate. In both of those circumstances, it was a very open process with you know, no backroom deals. Where presidents have gotten in trouble is when they have issued pardons outside of a transparent process, whether it's, you know, Judge Herbert Walker Bush and the Iran-Contra, Mark Rich, and then, of course, we get to Trump and Biden.
And almost all of Trump's pardons are outside the normal process.
What a surprise.
And then just quickly on Joe Biden, though, and you say the Hunter Biden pardon, you say that was a bad idea, too. You hit send on the book before Joe Biden pardoned his sister and brother for what exactly?
It remains mysterious to this day. I mean, just to remind you, with a couple of weeks left in his presidency, he pardoned Hunter. And as I say in the book, I thought, while it was understandable that he wanted to protect his son, and it is true that the government came down hard on Hunter, the government comes down hard on a lot of people, and none of them, except Hunter Biden, have a father who's president of the United States. And I just did not think, and do not think, that it reflected well on reflected well on Biden, not least because Biden had repeatedly said he wasn't going to do it. Right. But then, literally on the day of Trump's inauguration, Biden pardoned 5 of his other relatives. And this is where I think, you know, just to getting back to my thesis about, you know, revealing character, you know, Biden is obsessed with his family. And that's not at all a bad thing in general. But look, I mean, you know, we all know his history. His first wife and his daughter dies in that horrible car accident. His son dies while he's of cancer, a vice president. You know, and he's always talking about what it means to be a Biden. That was, you know, driving these pardons. And I think it demeaned his presidency to single out his family in such a way.
It also opens up a little bit of a door now going forward. Those were different. It felt qualitatively different. I mean, Hunter Biden was pardoned for a crime he was convicted of. Everyone else...
Actually, Hunter Biden was pardoned for the crime he was convicted of, but also any crime he might have committed during several years. The only other pardon of that kind was the one to Richard Nixon, who hadn't been charged with a crime at that point either. And you know, I don't believe in false, you know, one of the things I always try to be aware of is the arguments of false equivalency. But by pardoning Hunter and his family right before Trump took over, when Trump had promised that he was going to issue these appalling January 6 pardons, Biden opened himself up to people who were otherwise offended by Trump's pardons to say, well, look, you know, presidents do this kind of thing, and I don't support the Hunter Biden pardon, and I don't support the January 6 pardons. The January 6 pardons were much, much worse and much more numerous. But by doing what he did, especially how he did it, he gave a political opening to his adversaries, which was unfortunate.
You basically predict the January. This is, again, you published this before the January 6 pardons, and Jeffrey in this writes before that basically Trump, there was only ever one outcome where he was going to pardon everybody. You called it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as usual with Donald Trump, you don't have to be a psychic. You just listen to what he says. And he says he was going to pardon everybody, and people go, oh no, he wouldn't really do that. And I mean, the only question was, would he pardon absolutely everyone, or would he not pardon the most violent criminals? I mean, these people who beat the hell out of police officers, he pardoned everybody.
What's to keep? You know, Joe Biden pardoned his family members for any crimes they might have committed for this period of time. What's to keep every president from now on, from their last day in office, saying, I'm going to pardon all my family for anything that happened over the last X number of years?
Nothing.
So
nothing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and you know, that the only way you could change that is amend the Constitution, which fortunately is very difficult to do, and there's no movement to do it either. You know, if I can maybe anticipate a question, so is the pardon power worth keeping? Is it a good thing? And my answer is yes, it is a good thing, and we should keep the pardon power, and presidents should use it more, not less. There are 150,000 people in federal prison in the United States. They should not all be there. And if you look at our politics, there are all sorts of motivations to lock up more people, not fewer. And the pardon power exists as a possible check on what we would call mass incarceration today. And so I think that check should exist. My solution to the problem is to have better presidents. And that's and John, you're responsible for that.
Well, look, which president since Gerald Ford has used the pardon power most responsibly, or had the fewest number, if not maybe close to zero, of any of these controversial pardons?
Obama and George W. Bush. George W. Bush, the end of George W. Bush's presidency, the relationship between George Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, was sundered, and as I understand it, is sundered to this day because George Bush wouldn't pardon Scooter Libby, who was an aide to Dick Cheney, who had been prosecuted in a convoluted scandal. He had commuted his sentence, but he didn't issue a pardon. And George W. Bush was appalled by what happened in the last weeks of his presidency, where he said all these people came and said, pardon my cousin, pardon my friend, pardon my... And in the limousine, where, you know, the famous, you know, the incoming and outgoing president always take a limousine together from the White House to the Capitol for the swearing in, except when you're Donald Trump and you don't show up at Joe Biden's inauguration. But in the limousine where George W. Bush and Obama were in the car together, Bush says to Obama, get a pardon policy and stick to it, and don't listen to these special pleaders who come at the last minute. And by and large, Obama took that advice.
Yeah, this is one of those cases where no drama Obama was really true.
Yeah, absolutely. You cannot point to any controversial pardons or any really controversial.
Self-pardon. Can a president pardon himself?
Well, the accurate answer to that question is we don't know for sure, because no president has ever done it, which means that it's never been tested by the courts. But, I try to play out this argument in the book, and my conclusion is, especially in the current Supreme Court, the answer is yes. A president could pardon himself, because the dominant interpretive mode in the constitutional law today is known as textualism, where the Supreme Court should be bound by what's in the text of the Constitution and nothing else. It often comes up in the context of abortion. There's no, the Constitution says nothing about abortion, so the Constitution does not protect abortion. Well, the Constitution, the part of Article 2 about the pardon power, doesn't say the president can't pardon himself. It says he can't pardon for impeachments. But so I would think if it ever came to that, the court would say, yeah, he can't pardon himself.
How is the Constitution, by the way?
I would say it's a B+. I think the Constitution is good. I like the Bill of Rights. Giving each state 2 senators is insane. No, why should Wyoming have as many senators as California or Rhode Island? It's crazy. Anyway, so we can get on that too.
The reason I was asking that question that way is because, so we have some questions from the audience here. Should there be any limits on presidential power? You said it would take...
Well, presidential power.
Sorry,
yeah.
Presidential pardons.
Yeah.
Should there be any limitations on presidential pardons? And it would take an amendment to the Constitution. And that just
and as I say, I don't think the problem is the Constitution. I think the problem is the presidents and how they use it, and I don't want to see the chance for limitation, the chance for limiting. I was an assistant U.S. attorney. I know lots of people who were defense attorneys. I know the kind of people who go to prison, and a lot of them really deserve to be there. A lot of them don't deserve to be there as long as they are there. And I want there to be at least the possibility of people getting out early.
Could a congressional override? Is there any system?
Nothing. I mean, you couldn't. I mean, it's just the Constitution is clear, in the whole business of constitutional law is that. The definition of equal protection of the law or due process of law, we can fight about that endlessly. But the pardon power is pretty clear.
The questions are all basically on limitations or on adjustments. Presidents pardoning members of their own family, their relatives. First of all, it's actually happened now a fair amount, or it's happened at least, Biden and Clinton. I guess that's it. Biden.
Well, Clinton pardoned his brother. But I mean, in fairness, his brother had completed his sentence, and it was just to clean his record. I didn't think it was a good idea, but it was certainly different than Joe Biden pardoning Hunter right before he was about to be sentenced. And then we have the Hunter pardon, and then the other. I think you couldn't draw up a law that would cover it.
There's a question here. Is it possible Trump pardoned the January 6 rioters in order to pardon himself?
No, but I agree with the underlying idea. Again, to go with X-rays into the presidential soul. Donald Trump is the ultimate transactional person. I mean, if you look at his pardons, it's exactly the way he looks at every issue. He rewards his friends and he punishes his enemies. He pardoned Sheriff Joe Arpaio, the racist Arizona sheriff, who was a birther and an anti-immigrant activist. He pardoned all the people prosecuted by Robert Mueller because he hated Mueller. He pardoned Charles Kushner, his daughter's father-in-law, who was convicted in an egregious scheme in New Jersey, and he's now named him ambassador to France. And most importantly, he pardoned the January 6 people. And the important thing to remember about that is Donald Trump was a January 6 defendant also, because he was charged by Jack Smith with the conspiracy to try to overturn the election with the false electors. So by pardoning the January 6 people who were trying to overturn the election, he was pardoning himself. I mean, that too was a transaction. That's why he called it a day of love.
What did Robert Mueller think about dangling pardons and what complications that might pose?
Yeah, see, this is really, this is where the pardon story intersects with the story of the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. United States last year, which wound up probably killing off the cases before the two federal cases against Trump. But I don't think people realize the magnitude of the decision in Trump v. United States. What the court decided was that the president could never be prosecuted even after he left office, for crimes committed in the pursuit of his official duties. He could only be prosecuted for his unofficial acts. And what that means is virtually every act, including by Nixon in the Watergate cover-up, and certainly by Trump in the Mueller investigation, could never be prosecuted again. Because, for example, dangling a pardon, which Trump did, he has the official power to pardon him. So that's an official act, can't be prosecuted. One of the things Mueller investigated him for was firing Jim Comey, the FBI director, to limit the Russia investigation. Couldn't be prosecuted for it because he has the official right to pardon fire Comey. And this is such a dramatic change. And one of the things I point out is that in 1974, when every smart lawyer in America was looking at whether Richard Nixon could be prosecuted after he left office, not one person came up with the idea that he couldn't be pardoned for official duties. It didn't occur to anyone. Of course he could be the whole reason for the pardon was that he could be prosecuted. In the argument of Trump versus United States, Justice Jackson asked the question of Trump's lawyers. She says, if he's immune from prosecution, why did Ford pardon him? And the guy didn't have much of an answer except we should change the law. But they did. But
in a very literal sense here, the smoking gun tape is what? Is Nixon talking about getting the CIA to lean on the FBI, which by any modern definition would now be an official act?
An official act, because he has supervisory authority over the CIA and the FBI. And it was the release of that tape which caused the famous visit to the White House of Barry Goldwater, John Rose, who was the minority leader in the House, and Hugh Scott, the Republican leader in the Senate. This delegation of the grandees of the Republican Party to go to Nixon and said, we can't defend you anymore. This tape is indefensible. We think you need to resign. That today, Robert's opinion doesn't just say he can't be prosecuted for the official acts. He can't be investigated for official acts. So if the president is ever investigated again, and with Pam Bondi as Attorney General, I don't think this president's going to be investigated anytime soon. But if someday a president is investigated, he's going to be able, or she is going to be able to say, well, these are official duties. I'm not cooperating with this investigation at all. And I think he'd be right.
And in what way then? Again, and the pardons are wrapped up in this, but you also basically tell the story of is it Nixon, U.S. versus Nixon, or Nixon versus U.S.
Right.
I have the order wrong. How is the Trump case the bookend, the closure on what began there?
Well, if you recall, 1974, Archibald Cox is the special prosecutor. He is pursuing the White House tapes for evidence in the Watergate, in the cover-up investigation. Nixon tells him, stop, this is protected, I'm not going to let you pursue this. Ultimately, Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, quits rather than fire Cox. William Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General, is fired and then Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, third in line, ultimately does fire Cox. Leon Jaworski is appointed in his stead, but actually continues the quest to get the White House tapes. And in July of 1974, right before, it's kind of the final act of the, or almost final act of the Watergate investigation, the Supreme Court votes 8-0. William Rehnquist recuses himself because he worked for Nixon, and says Nixon has to turn over the tapes. And this has a considerable contemporary relevance because, one of the big issues now is Donald Trump complying with court orders? And Nixon did not seriously consider defying the Supreme Court, and he did turn over the remaining White House tapes, including the one that became the smoking gun. And now, we are in a situation where, especially in his second term, Donald Trump is taking a sufficiently aggressive role or view of executive power, where it is at least unclear whether he will actually comply.
J.D. Vance has made the suggestion that maybe the chief executive doesn't need to comply.
Right, and as usual with Trump and his administration, he said a lot of different things. In fairness, at the press conference, the one where Elon Musk's son was running around, that he did say, Trump did say, well, I always comply with court orders, but I appeal. And that's certainly appropriate. But at the same time, Vance has said, well, you can't force presidents to do things. I'm paraphrasing. And Musk has been tweeting that the presidents the judges who rule against Trump should be impeached. So I would say it's not entirely clear how this is all going to play out.
Do you think going forward the courts will be as much of a check now as they were to an extent then?
Well, one of my pet theories is that the federal judiciary now is more and more like the United States Senate. You have Democratic appointees and you have Republican appointees, and they view these issues very differently. A lot of these lower court judges who are ruling against Trump are appointees of Democratic presidents. There are 6 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court. I think Trump's chances are a lot better. And I think this is also where Trump's mindset matters. The ambiguity about whether Trump will comply with court orders is also a message to the Supreme Court, which is, hey, do you want to get into a fight with me? Do you want to have this ultimate confrontation, or rule in my favor and there are no problems? I don't think that's the way a transactional person thinks. So I think the studied ambiguity, and frankly, the mystery that we all share about like what happens if Trump defies a court order, one that's approved on appeal. How does it get enforced? It's not clear. And so Trump's message is, hey, let's avoid the whole problem. Just rule in my favor.
Just let's finish on Richard Nixon. What's his epilogue with the pardon? He gets the pardon and then lives happily ever after?
Well, more or less. I think that's how he is. One of the things I found very disturbing about the story is that Benton Becker and Ford, they go to Nixon, and one of their concerns is, oh, he's so old. He's 61. I resembled that remark, and I was like, he's not that old. And Nixon, he actually, in this period of 1974, has this very serious health crisis. He has phlebitis. He's in the hospital for a long time, but he lives for another 20 years. I wouldn't say that he, erases the stigma of Watergate. It's certainly a major part of his legacy, but he becomes an oracle of sorts. Reagan consults him now and then. Republican presidents consult him now and then. He dies when Clinton is president, and Clinton gives a eulogy that is respectful of his legacy. So is that happily ever after? I don't think it's, he never, but he does a hell of a lot better than if he'd been convicted and sentenced to prison.
And just the phlebitis story is good. So he had phlebitis, right?
Yes.
He never had to testify at any of the trials, which would have been interesting and would have set an interesting precedent in a way.
Well, it would have, although I am sure his lawyers would have told him to take the fifth if he hadn't been pardoned.
Can you take the fifth? Well, he had been pardoned at that point.
Oh, he had been pardoned.
So that's the thing.
Oh, yeah, I guess he probably couldn't have he couldn't have taken the fifth because he had accepted the pardon, unlike George Burdick. A little funny postscript to that is that, the Watergate cover-up trial, Nixon resigns in August. The cover-up trial starts like a month later. And Nixon is subpoenaed to testify, and Judge Sirica, a judge who was the judge, had his fill of Nixon, and he sends 3 doctors out to California to certify whether he's really sick, because he was convinced Nixon was lying, but the 3 doctors do actually certify that he was quite sick.
So he never did have to testify.
He never did have to testify, and he gave a famous interview to David Frost, for which he was very well paid, where he doesn't really acknowledge any wrongdoing in Watergate, and never, in his memoir, it's sort of the classic passive voice acknowledgement of responsibility, which is, mistakes were made.
And just in the writing of this book, not many people, I asked you this before we were together on TV a few weeks ago, not many people left alive at this point.
No, I wrote a book about the Patty Hearst case several years ago, almost 10 years ago, which took place simultaneously with all this.
She makes an appearance in this book.
That's it's a nod to my own work. You notice I put a footnote in citing myself. Because, hey, why not? I did, actually. But virtually all the protagonists in the Patty Hearst case from 1974 were in their 30s at the time. And so 30 years later, they're like all in their 60s, and people in their 60s, notwithstanding what they thought about Nixon, are actually fine. And so virtually everyone in the Patty Hearst story was still alive. Fast forward 10 years, virtually everyone in the Nixon story was in their 50s or older. 50 plus 50 not so many people still around. The only people who are around, John Dean, because he was a young lawyer in the White House, and many of the members of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, the people who were urging...
The kid lawyers.
The kid lawyers, Richard Benveniste, George Frampton, Charles Breyer, and Stephen Breyer, the former Supreme Court Justice, they're all still alive, but they were not protagonists. So this was the first book I wrote that is really, much closer to a work of history, because fortunately, the Ford Library in Ann Arbor not only has tremendous records, virtually everyone did extensive oral history interviews, including Becker at great length, and that was extremely helpful.
Do all their stories line up?
More or less. I mean, Haig denies that he proposed a deal, but Ford is pretty clear, and the people around him are pretty clear that. But other than that, the stories do line up pretty closely.
And you do think Haig did propose a deal?
Oh, 100%, 100%. Because that's the kind of person he was. There's a piece of paper with options that yes, I do believe he proposed a deal, but Ford, to his credit, didn't take it.
Well, thank you. Did I miss anything? Is there anything?
No. I just wanted to inform the audience that in a tragic childhood accident, Berman lost his first name. And so I'm not the only person who calls him Berman. Everybody calls him Berman. And thank you, Berman, and thank you all for coming.